Hello, everyone, and welcome to Politics is Sexy. We've got our weekly panel here. Tom Farmer is the former CNN producer, and Rich Rubino is with the Huffington Post. He's a columnist. He's an author. Gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening, Esther.
All right, so we're going to be talking about the 50th anniversary on the war on poverty that Lyndon B. Johnson started, and also unemployment benefits, and whether they benefit the economy, whether they benefit people in general. But we begin with this bizarre story out of New Jersey that I bet if Chris Christie wasn't running for president, perhaps we wouldn't be giving it so much attention. But for today, almost 2-hour press conference. He apologized. He felt bad. He fired some people. He distanced himself from some people. Tom Farmer, was he convincing?
I think he was pretty convincing. I thought it was quite a performance. That press conference went on for about an hour and a half, and the transcript is pretty dramatic. I think he did exactly what he had to do, and it pretty much was the only play left to him, was to get out in front of it, be complete, answer questions for as long as the press kept asking them. It kind of reminded me of the Geraldine Ferraro press conference when she was Fritz Mondale's running mate at 84, and her husband was charged with some shady real estate thing. And she had to go out there and answer questions for as long as the press was interested, which was hours. And this was not so different. The reason the press is fascinated is not only because Chris Christie is a presidential contender, but because this behavior kind of fits the narrative that's taken hold about him. Is that he's a big, brusque, blunt Jersey guy who throws his elbows around and doesn't have any trouble making enemies. And this sure looks like the kind of thing a guy like that would do, whether he did it or not. I tend to think he's telling the truth. He's smart enough to know that if he were making up what he said today and that were discovered, he would be a dead man. So I tend to think that this is not the end of the world for him. It's a pretty entertaining story, and we'll see what happens next.
And that's my question to you, Rich Rubino. Did he survive this? Can he come out of this looking good? He seemed very humble, and unlike past conferences where some have called him a bully, he seemed humble to me.
Yeah, he was able to stand up. The only people I can think of who can speak for that long, albeit extemporaneously, but I'm thinking Louis Farrakhan and Fidel Castro when they give these, 4-hour addresses. I don't really think of it in terms of Chris Christie.
And Ted Cruz.
But no, it's interesting. And Ted, yes, and Rand Paul, I guess, now that we say it. But it's very interesting. I think he can survive it as long as there's no smoking gun directly linking him to this. I always say it was an underling. He had a couple of rogue staffers. He had a few. He can say I hired this many people on my staff, and unfortunately, there's always a few bad apples. He didn't even seem to be saying that. He just seemed to be saying, I apologize. So it's interesting. But I think the more interesting part, and the reason that one might be inclined to believe Chris Christie, unless he is a complete egomaniac and he's always looking for some sort of electoral recriminations. If you do a cost-benefit analysis on this, the benefit is so small. Basically, what Christie, I think, was doing, he was trying to mimic George W. Bush's strategy back in 1998. George W. Bush went all out running for re-election, even though there was never any question that George W. Bush was going to be re-elected. He ended up getting 68% of the vote. And what he did is he went out and did a lot of Democratic parts of the state. He actually got 60%, for example, of the female vote. He got 49% of the Hispanic vote. He got 24% of the African-American vote. Then in 2000, he comes along in the primaries, first of all, and he says, I'm electable because I'm able to garner votes in parts of my state that are not necessarily hospitable to Republicans. Chris Christie was trying to do the same thing. What Bush did is he got the endorsement of the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor, both Democrats. So Christie was trying to get as many Democrats to endorse him as possible. But the idea that he would get the mayor of Fort Lee, New Jersey, would just have been one of many Democrats who did endorse him. So the fact that he didn't endorse him, no one would have cared if he did endorse him. He just would have been a list. He could say, I have 51 elected officials who have endorsed me, 51 rather than 50. But the fact of the matter is nobody even knows where Fort Lee is in the rest of the country, never mind who the mayor is.
Well, they sure know where it is now.
Yeah, they do know him now. It's great for tourism, I guess. But.
And,
Well, now, wait a moment. Rosanna Dana used to answer viewer mail from the same guy in Fort Lee, New Jersey every week. Mr. Richard Fader of Fort Lee, New Jersey. The whole country used to know where Fort Lee was. I guess that's no longer a big deal, but Saturday Night Live used to be a big deal.
But
Yes.
for some of us, it still is, Tom. Going back to the George Washington Bridge, always busy now for days. It held up, reports show that it held up some emergency workers, people going late to school. It was the first week back to school. Some kids didn't get to school till about noon. I mean, it really affected some people. And Chris Christie fired one of his staff members over this. Did he do the right thing, Tom, in coming out and giving this press conference and apologizing and driving all the way to Fort Lee, despite the fact that the mayor told him he did not want to meet with him? Chris Christie went, he apologized. In terms of a political, tactical, damage control, did he do the right thing?
I don't know what the hell else you do in a situation like this, but be as open as possible, fire the people who exercised poor judgment, and go hat in hand to the guy that you alienated and the people of Fort Lee to seek forgiveness. I think anything else would have fallen short. The interesting thing to me is that the liberal press, read today's New York Daily News, read the left-wing press in New York City, and they're all saying that, that Christie's a dead man. His hopes for 2016 are finished. This will destroy him. Well, a couple of things. Democratic candidates like Bill Clinton weathered things like the Jennifer Flowers scandal much closer to Election Day and did okay. So this is not a fatal blow by any stretch. And to those who disbelieved the Christie line that I didn't know what my staff was up to, that I didn't understand that they were lying to me, those people are inclined to give President Obama a pass when he says he didn't know what was going on at the IRS, he didn't know what was going on with Benghazi, I didn't know what was going on at the NSA, I didn't understand the Obamacare website wasn't working. That's all okay. But when Chris Christie says he didn't know his chief of staff was tying up traffic in Fort Lee, that's not credible. Well, you can't have it both ways. I think it's pretty clear he didn't know what was going on, and, we're going to get past this.
Yeah.
I will say though that there were two front runners who never did. Clinton being, I guess, the perhaps the exception to the rule, because remember, one of them is George Romney back in 1967 in the interview where he said that he was brainwashed that he was brainwashed into supporting the Vietnam War by the generals. He never recovered from that, and Richard Nixon got the nomination. And then the other one that that's the more recent memory is Gary Hart. And that was his latest thing in 1987, where he told the press, you can follow me around, I'm an honest person. And then they found him with Donna Rice on a boat affectionately called Monkey Business. So, I mean, and both of those gentlemen were front runners for their nominations at the time, and both of those imploded and were never able to come back. Bill Clinton, of course, has come back from just about anything, including a loss, the first time he ran for governor. Then he came back in 1982, so he's almost, I think, the exception to the rule.
Okay.
Well, it's a little less than 2 years until the Iowa caucus, so that gives people time to forget all about the George Washington Bridge in Fort Lee, New Jersey.
Exactly.
Although I'm sure Rand Paul will remind them.
We'll see how much traction Rand Paul really has, but we'll get to that later.
Okay.
Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, whoever else.
Let's move on to the unemployment benefits extension and also the 50th anniversary on the war of poverty. Interesting vote earlier this week in the Senate where few Republicans sided with Democrats on a vote, basically a procedural vote that would allow this unemployment benefit extension to be decided. There's still no decision as the time of this taping, but it looks like they may be closer to some kind of consensus on paying for this. I want to ask you, Tom, specifically about the Republicans and this sort of appearance or sort of change of tone by the Republicans on unemployment benefits. What's your take?
Well, Republicans have constituents who have been out of work for months and months, just like Democrats, and they're in no position to shed more voters at this stage. The Republicans have done themselves enough damage in the last 6 months. The long-term unemployment will tend to affect more older voters and older white males disproportionately, and that's a Republican constituency. So this is simple politics. They got to find a way to keep these people from losing their homes and being thrown out on the street, while at the same time preserving some revenue neutrality and finding ways to pay for the extending the program by driving cuts in other areas and then save a little face that way. But the Republicans can't adopt any more Ebenezer Scrooge face and risk hemorrhaging additional support.
I don't know if you saw Marco Rubio's recent comment about this, that he thinks that all these programs should just be stopped by the federal government and be given to states to oversee. Rich Rubino, what do you think?
No, generally I am in favor of a devolution of power, specifically not only to the states but also to the municipal levels, just because they tend to know more about their constituents versus, there's certainly a difference between, for example, rural poverty versus poverty in Indian reservations versus poverty in the African American community. So there certainly are different ways of dealing with it. So yeah, I do think that generally, if you block grant it to the states and then give it to the municipalities, then you have more of a human approach and have somebody who's actually accountable directly to those voters, and then he's appointing the person. The mayor is appointing somebody to deal with this stuff. So I do think that that's a benefit.
So this bill still is in the Senate. They're yet to vote on it. It sounds like they have some kind of a mechanism that would pay for it down the line. Then they face a big hurdle in the House. How's that going to play out, Tom?
Well, if it plays out like the budget deal played out before Christmas, just fine. If you can get a coalition, if Boehner can get a coalition together of centrist Republicans and a few Democrats, then, the thing will pass. And as you well know, all the strategy meetings in the highest circles of the Republican Party are about how to look a little less like monsters and how to look a little more sympathetic towards the plight of the American middle class. They're embracing the income inequality issue. They're trying to come up with ways to promote growth and express sympathy for people who've lost their nest eggs and people who've been out of work for a long time. So they have a vested interest in making this go. At the end of the day, it's only a few dozen outlier, extreme Republican Tea Party types who are going to vote against this.
In the past, there hasn't really been a mechanism to pay for this. In other words, the benefits were extended, but there wasn't really some kind of a revenue stream. And this time it appears that Democrats will be agreeing to paying for it down the road, taking the money from a different pot. Tom, what's your take on that? I think we lost Rich there for a sec. Rich, you there?
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
I see you, Rich.
Oh, I see you. Okay, sorry about that. What do you make of that, Rich? I was going to give it to you, then I didn't see you. There you go. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I was wondering, but no, this is me. I am here.
Thank God.
I think this actually, it's interesting how I think the dynamics have changed. I remember specifically under the Bush administration, they had there was the Democrats, specifically the Blue Dog Democrats, who supported the pay-as-you-go provisions for much of it for the Iraq War, meaning that for every dollar that you spend has to be deficit neutral. You have to find a way. Now the whole there's kind of been a transmogrification, and it's the opposite now. The Democrats are saying, they don't necessarily need to find a way to pay for it and use the past system. The Republicans are saying find a way to pay for it. But I think there's a real divergence here between the conservative intelligentsia, certainly we hear on talk radio, who are trying to use intellectual arguments, for example, why unemployment benefits are not effective, versus those who are actually in the trenches, in the arena, who actually have constituents who have to face the voters for re-election. And it's very hard to make that intellectual argument when you're talking to somebody, when you're talking to a constituent in Columbus, Ohio, who's out of work or knows somebody who's out of work, to say, well, we have to deal with the deficit. These are people who are dealing with, I think it's more of a bread and butter issue for these individual constituents. And I think there really is a disconnect between the intelligentsia who kind of sit there, in the talk radio booths and say, this is bad, and this encourages irresponsibility, and those who actually have constituents who are unemployed, or who know people who are unemployed, who are really
suffering,
waiting for these benefits.
Yeah.
Who are very.
Ronald Reagan used to say a recession is when your neighbor loses his house, and a depression is when you lose yours. And this downturn has hit awfully close to home and across an awful broad swath of the economy. And it would be foolish, I think, to dismiss every long-term unemployed person as a chiseler or somebody who's trying to cheat the system. It's just not the case. Now, you got to find a way to incent people to get back to work and not to turn down jobs that are less than ideal and continue to live on federal dollars in perpetuity. I think that's a problem also, perhaps, in some cases. But the bigger issue is maintaining political support, which is much more a Republican problem right now than a Democratic problem.
Well,
Tom, if I could just digress for a minute, I just wanted to say that you brought up the Reagan quote. In 1980, he actually had an inimitable slogan. He said when your neighbor loses your job, it's a recession. When you lose your job, it's a depression. When Jimmy Carter loses his job, it's a recovery. So that was his political line. That was his political line. Right. That's where that came from. Then he changed that, but that was how it originated.
Okay, so this is a good segue, you guys, to the Convince Me, where you both get a minute to convince me, and you both mentioned some of it. Is it good for the economy? Is it not? How do you keep people incentivized to keep looking for work? Basically, does unemployment benefits and benefits in general work to spur the economy, help people get back to work? What are your thoughts? Convince me either way. Rich Rubino, you go first. Ready, go.
Yeah, there's no yes or no answer to this. The answer is it's mixed. Although the advantage is actually in terms of I know it's nuanced here, but the advantage in terms of stimulating the economy is they have found, the Census Bureau has found, for example, that for every $1 given in unemployment, $1.60 is spent in terms of stimulating the economy, because theoretically the people who are unemployed aren't necessarily going to go out and spend and buy they're going to buy the necessities. They're going to buy coal. They're going to buy food, and then that's going to somehow work into the economy. But obviously, when you have a system that people are on it for too long of a period of time, there is a point of diminishing returns in terms of whether that disincentivizes the possibility of somebody going out to look for a job. But certainly in a time when you have long-term unemployment, which is actually at a record high going back all the way to World War II. Yeah, the answer is yes, but it's nuanced.
Okay, Tom Farmer.
As you mentioned, this is the 50th anniversary of LBJ declaring war on poverty. At the time, 50 years ago, the poverty rate in this country was about 19%. Today, it is roughly 15%. That's not a lot of return for all the tens and tens of billions of dollars that have been thrown at poverty over 50 years to knock the rate down by 4 whole percentage points. So it's pretty clear that just throwing money at the problem is not an effective curative. However, turning off the money tap entirely and suggesting these people die or go off on ice floes or something, which has been the Republican solution, is even more ineffective. Every incentive within these programs has got to turn on turning people back into productive taxpayers. We need people to pay income tax so we can get the country funded and running again. And if we're not incenting the right kinds of things, if we're not applying nuance to the programs, then they're pointless. But if we are teaching people new skills, encouraging them to take jobs, fixing things like a child care and student loans so people are in a position to work and don't have to stay home, those are dollars well spent. And we're not seeing the difference in Washington right now, and we should.
Okay. So neither one of you answered me. And here's the nuance. Neither one of you convinced me of any of it. Neither one of you. Where's Ed Rombach when I need him? Let's go.
Well, wait. What do you think? Hold the phone.
Oh, here we go. Tom, I do agree with you that there has to be some type of a program that teaches people those skills that they need to get back to work. Give them, I think there should be limits to how long you receive these unemployment benefits, and on the side are forced to either do continuing education or show proof that you are looking for work. I'm sorry, but there is work out there. There is perhaps not as much of a pay as people are used to, but that there is pay. There is work there. Do you?
You know where the most jobs per capita right now that are unfilled are?
Where?
Odessa, Texas. Odessa, Texas.
Odessa, Texas.
So if you want a job, go to Odessa, Texas.
Okay, and what are the jobs in? And that's the other question. The service sector is always looking for work, and of course, that's not going to pay all the bills, but it's a start.
But no, it's not. If a lot of service jobs are $8-9 an hour, you can't support a family on that pay. You can't support yourself on that pay. The problem is that when we gain jobs, the gross statistics don't reflect the fact that those jobs tend to pay less and tend to be less secure, and aren't jobs you can run a household on. College kids can work at Arby's for $8.25 an hour. A breadwinner with 2 kids and a mortgage cannot. So, how do you tell that person to take that job when, if he does, he'll lose his house. He'll just lose it a little more slowly.
The choice is not having a job.
The choice is having a meaningless job that doesn't not only doesn't build skills, but fails to provide for your family. You'll starve a little more slowly. That's all.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's a homeless shelter 6 months later than you otherwise might. So we need structural reset.
Absolutely, and this is a subject that I think we should keep exploring. I know there's a great community outreach program here called Lazarus House, and they have shelters, and they give people a place where they can build new skills, look for a job while they take care of all their basics. And people from all walks of life go there right now. So it's something to think about, to revamp this whole notion of government handouts. Let's talk about this war on poverty in the 50 years, how far we've come. Tom, you said we've only down to 15%, and African Americans and children are at an alarming rate. What else needs to be done to get this number down? And what responsibility is it for the private sector to get involved?
Well, yeah, I think the private sector is fairly involved if you look at the right sectors. If you're running Walmart or you're running McDonald's, you don't have to get involved because there is an endless supply of people willing to take menial jobs which don't support families and don't create a future and pay you pin money, beer money. But if you want skilled labor, if you want people to work for the long term, if you want people to establish careers, then it's obviously well worth investing in on the part of the private sector, and lots of companies do. Out here in the Pacific Northwest, we have Boeing pouring enormous sums into training and vocational programs because they can't get enough skilled engineers to put these airplanes together. And if they can create those jobs and create those skills, then they assure their own future. So, of course, that's a role for the private sector. The role for the government has got to add up to more, as I said earlier, than just throwing money at people who are out of work, because you're not necessarily creating an incentive to go back to work. You're not creating newly skilled workers. You're not transforming the skill sets that are needed for the 21st century. You're subsidizing people who will be happy to remain in that state. So we have to find a way to create incentives, not just subsidies. I think that's the key difference, and that hasn't happened in the war on poverty. Right now we're sitting at 47 million Americans on food stamps. It's about 1/6 of the gross population of this country. So that's not a very successful war on poverty. It looks like things are actually getting worse.
Rich, do the Republicans have a new message on this war on poverty? We talked earlier that, they are changing their tune about unemployment benefits, but what about poverty?
Yeah, it was actually, I think The Republican ideas for, in terms of poverty, actually, a lot of it began, I think, with Congressman Jack Kemp in Buffalo in 1980, the idea of empowerment zones. They didn't use conservative means to fix liberal ends. It was kind of like Bill Clinton in welfare reform. You use more democratic means to basically fix a conservative problem. You kind of co-opted somewhat. I remember, and I'm surprised that Barack Obama specifically in his speech today, what I would have done is I would have brought in Bill Clinton and Denny Hastert. And I would have had them stand behind me because in 2000, this was after the impeachment. Remember, after Denny Hastert had voted for the impeachment of Bill Clinton and Denny Hastert toured the country basically supporting the New Markets Initiative, New Market tax credits. They would go to places like rural Arkansas. They would go to the Pine Ridge Reservation where poverty is over 80%. And they would say about how they need to give tax credits to companies to invest in these parts of the country. And this really unifies, for example, the rural Arkansas and inner city Harlem versus the Indian reservations. They all kind of have that common interest. But I actually don't think the war on poverty was a failure. I think it was a failure in terms of it was really a bold pronouncement when Lyndon Johnson said, we're going to end poverty in the entire country. That's not going to necessarily happen. It's like we say a war on drugs, or when George W. Bush says a war on terror. How do you eliminate a tactic? How are you ever going to eliminate drugs? No. But there has been solid progress on the war on poverty. Poverty is down, specifically, by the way, elderly poverty, which was 35% in 1960, and now it's down to about 9%. But remember, this really hasn't been, what I keep hearing in the media is this has been a 50-year war on poverty. Remember, a lot of this was 64, 65, and a lot of that money was diverted right around 66, 67 when LBJ started to really escalate the troop levels in Vietnam. And that's what a lot of, I think, Martin Luther King, for example,
so not really 50 years.
Who was a strong supporter of war on poverty, ended up becoming a critic of Vietnam because he was saying a lot of the money was going toward Vietnam. So it's not like this has been,
a continuous
process for this really about 64, 65, 66 when the war on poverty was really reached its high watermark. There really hasn't been a president who's proposed a huge initiative like that.
Yeah. Before we do our final thoughts, I want to say a few things to our audience members watching us. If you are watching us on YouTube, we also broadcast live on live stream at 7 o'clock on Thursday. If you're watching us on live stream, check us out on YouTube as well, and also our Facebook page, Politics is Sexy. Okay, guys, this is one of my favorite parts, the What Am I Missing? Final thoughts. And Tom Farmer, you get to go first.
Oh, good, because what you're missing, and what a lot of us are missing, is the striking shrinkage of the Republican Party and the rise of independents. Gallup put out a fascinating poll this week, which says 42% of us now identify as political independents, highest number ever. Republican identification has gone down to 25%, lowest number ever. In fact, Republican ID has fallen 9 points in the last 10 years. About 34% when George W. Bush was reelected, 24% now. Democrats, 31%. So neither party has strong ID, but the Republican Party is absolutely hemorrhaging support. Now, that's why the Chris Christie thing is so interesting. They dare not kick Chris Christie to the curb because he looks like one of the very few rank-and-file Republicans who can attract some independents, and the Republicans cannot win without attracting a lot more people outside their own tent. That's why when we say, Ted Cruz is a rock star, Ted Cruz is a front runner within the Republican Party, you got to say, well, he's got 30% of what? Pretty much, small nut of the American people. 30% of 25% is about 8%. That's not enough to win an election for anything.
Okay, Tom,
you got to look at the long-term trends.
Give me 10 seconds of what you think the Republicans need to do to get support back.
They have to convince people that they are for something and not just against everything.
Okay. Rich Rubino.
Yeah, and Tom, I would add, by the way, in Alaska, that number of independents is actually 61%. And in Massachusetts, known as, the Democratic Citadel, it's actually 53% are independents. So those are two, and Alaska, of course, considered a very Republican state. If you think of politics in the United States Congress is polarized now, wait till the next election. what you're really seeing is essentially almost the elimination of moderates. In the House of Representatives this past week, Jim Gerlach of Pennsylvania announced he's not running for re-election. What you basically have is a lot of Republicans in swing districts who have barely held on, and a lot of Democrats on the other side, for example, Mike McClincher in North Carolina and Jim Matheson in Utah, who are perhaps the only Democrats who could actually hold their seats, are retiring because they know this is going to be a Republican year, and they would rather go out on top than losing an election. I think there's only 14 blue dog Democrats left right now, and that's going to fall. And it was actually 54 in 2006 after the 2006 wave election, which brought a lot of Democrats into power. And if you look at the Senate, who are the vulnerable Democrats? They're the last few Southern Democrats. Mark Pryor in Arkansas, Kay Hagan in North Carolina, Mark Begich in Alaska, Mary Landrieu in Louisiana.
Okay,
you could
Rich.
very possibly see in this next election virtually no moderates. It is amazing that this is. If you think it's polarized now, just wait till the next election.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so we're both kind of saying the same thing, aren't we? You know, it's the more
Yes,
people
just in different ways.
The more extreme the parties get, the more people end up in the middle, in the gray zone. Most Americans live in the gray middle.
That's right.
And they all have no elected, and they won't have any elected officials.
Yeah. Nobody they voted for, anyway.
All right, Rich Rubino, columnist and author, Tom Farmer, formerly with CNN. Thank you, gentlemen, for another great Politics is Sexy, and we'll see you next week on another edition. Good night.
All right.